Okay, so first of all, I would actually like to dedicate this talk to Professor Carl Ostrom. I think most of you know, or should know, who he is. He's sort of the grandfather of control and Modelica in many sense. But the story is I was visiting Lund in 2018 and gave a talk, here's the slides, on this 4-zone heat pump. And of course, Carl sat right in the front with his hands folded, leaning forward, and listened very patiently. And at one point, I showed the spectrum, the eigenvalues of this system. And Carl asked one question, and it was, what are those slow modes? and I thought, well, I kind of know, but I didn't have a good enough answer. And so I gave him a partial answer. And I sort of forgot about this, but more recently, we've been doing work in using these Modelica models for state estimation, where this answer becomes actually quite important. And so we thought we'd write down at least our answer, and hopefully it's correct. But I still think it's incomplete. There's still some more work that could be done. So what's the problem? Basically, in a lot of vapor compression simulations and models, many authors have noted that the refrigerant mass is not conserved. It tends to leak out, particularly over long timescale simulations. And this paper's about what is the root cause of that. And they're basically related to the fundamental modeling assumptions. There are several implications of this, not just for control design and estimation, but for just doing simulation. We present two solutions, remedies, I should say, and a few examples. Of course, it wouldn't be a paper unless you have a Cartesian pendulum example. So this is not just for vapor compression systems. So as I said, as many authors, as recently as the last Modelica conference, the Modelon group wrote a paper on this problem. You see if you run simulations, the refrigerant mass tends to vary, and it actually tends to leak out. And so if you run a long timescale simulation, like an annual simulation of a vapor compression system, or a car driving cycle, this can be a problem. And it's not that the refrigerant mass is actually leaking out of the system, right? We're not modeling that. It's caused by some numerical issues related to the modeling assumptions. So, here's a very simple example. It's the simplest example that you can imagine. We have, basically a 2-volume vapor compression system. So this has 4 states. It's always a good idea to find the simplest example that exhibits the problem you're trying to study and then study that one. And of course, when we initialize this system, you see a very small amount of refrigerant mass drift for the first 5 seconds or so, and then it settles into its equilibrium. Now, that might not be a problem. I think a lot of authors, for a lot of problems, this small change would not be significant. But if we start to actuate the compressor and the valve and run for a long simulation, you'll see that the mass will actually drift over time, and that's not desirable. So really, the next 2 slides are the main result. Why is this? And it's actually quite fundamental. Where do these models come from? They come from the expression of the conservation equations, right? Mass, energy, and momentum. But the conservation of mass implies the equation that I circled there. It implies that the way the conservation of mass is expressed in these equations is actually as a derivative of the total mass in the system, right? What we write down is the mass flow rate in minus the mass flow rate out has to equal some change in the density, which is the derivative here. And anytime you've done that, what you're doing is you're expressing the conservation of mass as actually its time derivative. And that is the equation that's in the model. And that's the fundamental cause for why the mass will actually drift during a simulation. So this result is not just restricted to vapor compression systems. It's any time you've made that basic modeling assumption. It doesn't matter if the energy or the momentum equations are in this or not. It doesn't matter what variables you've chosen. This is why. And then, of course, Modelica is a very powerful language, and so we encode these into object-oriented libraries, and we assemble big models, and we run simulations, and we kind of forget about the fact that, we've made that. It's not an error. It's just a certain assumption. Now, for our systems, essentially, this is a presentation about math, right? So if you look down on the lower left, instead of writing these ugly equations, I'm just going to simplify this and write it as one set of differential equations where the state x is, we will choose here the pressure and enthalpy in each control volume. So there's an even number of states. Doesn't matter if you want to use T and S or whatever, it doesn't matter. And then there's a constraint on the total mass. And the constraint, which I'll call G here, is a function that you use to initialize this. So, if you want to start with some initial refrigerant mass, we use that equation to set the initial conditions for pressure and enthalpy in each control volume, and then you run your simulation, right? But what's important is that that mass constraint function does not appear explicitly in the model. Its time derivative does. And so that's the real problem. So essentially all the results are on this slide. And if you do work in this area, I think this picture that we drew is an important one to have in your mind when you run simulations and try to figure out where your refrigerant mass has gone. And so the math here is actually quite simple. We have this, so I rewrote the dynamics on the upper right there, and so they may be expressed slightly different in Modelica, but that's what's being simulated, and we can represent the system like that mathematically. So if you differentiate the mass constraint, then that's written in the upper left, and then basically compute alinearization. What we find out is that the gradient of the mass constraint, right, evaluated at any equilibrium. So that's a gradient vector. It's non-zero unless there's no mass in it at all, and that has to be the left eigenvector of any linearization corresponding to a zero eigenvalue. And that's the key result. Now, if there's a left eigenvector, then there's a right eigenvector, and so I'm going to call V0 that right eigenvector. But for any model like this, you're going to have one eigenvalue at the origin. And so now the math is over. There are a bunch of implications to this, really 6 implications. The first one is that this might be a surprise, but the equilibrium solution is not exponentially stable in any of these models. You always have an eigenvalue at the origin. Therefore, it is what we sometimes call marginally stable. But even though you think, oh, it's a vapor compression system, the dynamics are stable, that's true, but they're not exponentially stable. It also means that there is a whole family of equilibrium solutions, and so that's this red manifold, an equilibrium manifold, and each point on that manifold corresponds to a different refrigerant mass. So that manifold is parameterized by the total refrigerant mass, and then there's an n-1 dimensional manifold, an integral manifold, where the dynamics evolve. So we're simulating an n-dimensional system, but it's actually restricted to an n-1 dimensional invariant manifold for all of these simulations. Now, the analytic solutions, the mathematical solutions, are invariant. They will stay on that manifold, and the mass will be conserved. But inevitably, there are numerical errors when you compute numerical solutions to this, and the numerical errors will cause drift off this manifold. Okay? And once the state is off that manifold, the solver doesn't remember, oh, I was originally on this manifold. It doesn't remember anymore. It only remembers the current state. And so you get drift along this, not right along that red manifold, that's the equilibrium manifold, but you'll get drift onto a different sheave, a different integral manifold. And that's what's happening when the refrigerant drift, leaks out or drifts in these simulations. And it's inevitable. What's very important is that eigenvalue is at 0. So it's not stable. This constraint is not stabilized in this direction. And so any solver will do this. And that's the main result. I'm kind of done. The rest are implications, and then how do we fix this if we need to fix it? We don't always need to fix this. So again, these are the main implications. If you're doing a simulation, you're simulating a stiff system, so we have to use some kind of implicit solver like Dasel. but there's also an eigenvalue at the origin. Usually, that's okay. You know, if you do a simulation for a short period of time, it might drift a little bit, who cares? But it's very important to then monitor what that drift was, right? You just can't ignore this. This mass constraint is not stabilized in the language of differential algebraic equations. Its derivative has been stabilized. So numerical errors will always cause some drift. And it's kind of like a random walk, but this is not a stochastic simulation, so don't take that interpretation too far. We have a hypothesis for why that refrigerant mass always tends to drift out, get lower until you run out, and not get larger. I'm happy to explain that, but probably don't have enough time here. You know, a different solver or reducing the tolerance, these can help. Change of coordinates can help, but they don't address the root cause. Another kind of interesting point is, semi-interesting, you know, we tend to think of the states as pressures and enthalpies and pressures and enthalpies, and oh, the fluid mass, the refrigerant mass is not a state. So that's true. It is not an explicit state. But actually, the refrigerant mass is a state of the system. It's a nonlinear combination of all of those states. So, you know, if we write this in canonical coordinates and, you know, in terms of spectral decomposition, then the refrigerant would become an explicit state. It's the one associated with the equilibrium manifold here. Okay. There are a bunch of implications for this. So when we do model reduction, for example, and there are a lot of reasons to do model reduction. I'm a control engineer, so I do model reduction all the time. You have to be very careful. So you have to linearize the system. You have to manually take out this mode and then do, you know, whatever model reduction you want to do, a singular perturbation or a Hankel norm, you know, truncation or whatever, and not put that mode back in. The MATLAB tools are great. I use MATLAB a lot. The MATLAB tools tend to do an awful lot underneath the hood. I mean, that's an example of open software. You can read what these things are doing, but it's not open source, of course. They tend to do things like, if you just reduce the model, what that balReal command actually does is it says, oh, I'm going to take out that slow mode for you, reduce the stable part, and then I'm going to put it back in because I think you're a control engineer and you want to have that mode back in the system. So you actually have to take it out manually and pay a lot of attention to the details. So, so one question one of the reviewers asked, you know, my co-authors wrote a paper almost 10 years ago now on, you know, looking at different coordinate changes that address this problem. What about these, what I call PhD coordinates, right? Pressure, enthalpy, and density. There's a very short mathematical proof here, but it turns out that this does not address the issue at all. It, in some sense, makes it a little bit worse. So what PhD coordinates are is, instead of having just two fluid coordinates like pressure and enthalpy per volume, we're going to relax one of the algebraic constraints and we'll have three differential equations per control volume. And it does actually work in terms of improving the numerical aspects of these simulations and better maintaining the total amount of mass. But the proof's actually easy. If we write down the system first in a different coordinate system, the pressures and the densities, so that's just the coordinate change, and then we explicitly write an algebraic equation for the enthalpies. So the idea here is, instead of having an algebraic constraint, we'll make that a differential equation. So it turns out that then you will end up with m+1 eigenvalues at the origin. And so now I have a much larger space where I could potentially drift. So why does this seem to work better in some simulations? It's probably because you have more states under explicit error control of, like, the Dassel solver, and so it will recognize some of the drift in the automatic error control. But it's not you know, in general, you have to kind of understand what this would do to the structure. This could have drift in other directions aside from the refrigerant mass. So here's a couple of solutions. So the simplest solution, and this is not an invention, this is a common thing that's done in these types of problems, is we'll have some kind of fake feedback that adds and subtracts mass into the cycle that's compensated with some P or PI controller. And that actually will solve the problem of that unstable constraint, right? So now we're going to stabilize that manifold. And what's nice is this is very simple to understand from a control theory point of view. So now I have a feedback loop. I can completely understand what's going on here from a root locus. So this is the same root locus, just on a different scale. The one on the right's a little bit easier to see. So this is that original system with just 4 states. So there are not a lot of states, but there's, of course, 3 exponentially stable eigenvalues and then 1 at the origin. I'm going to use a PI controller. I could have used a P, but I like PI. So I put another pole at the origin, and then I just put a 0 just to the left of it and increase the gain. And of course, those 2 poles at the origin move into the open left half plane, and now the system is exponentially stable. Now, we have changed the dynamics a little bit, because these other poles are going to move a tiny little bit, but not much. And actually, we didn't prove this in the paper, but the structure of that manifold stays the same, so you're not actually changing the geometry. And if you think about it, this controller is not active. It's outputting 0, so the feedback loop is open, unless you drift off the manifold, and then it starts to add a little bit of extra mass. So you're not really changing the dynamics. You're not changing the statics or of the problem at all, and the dynamic changes is slight compared to. So how does this work? Here's just a simulation, of course. On the left, that's what I showed you earlier. You get that initial mass drift. You add this feedback loop on the right. So the plots are flipped, and you can see the enthalpies and the pressures. They don't change much, but you can't tell much at this scale anyway. But the mass is then regulated at its initial condition properly. So for these fluid problems, this is probably a good way to solve the problem. It's mathematically justified if this is a problem, right? I'm not saying that you have to, now always have this kind of feedback in all of the vapor compression simulations you do. It's only if the mass seems to be drifting. There is kind of a more mathematical way of doing this exactly. So this is a method from Bill Gear, where you can basically add back in the constraint. So if the sort of middle equations are the kind of key equations. It's a very simple idea mathematically when I write things in such a simple way. But we have this set of differential equations. Of course, I can't just add back in the mass constraint equation, because now I have too many equations, right? And so Bill Gear's idea was, well, we're going to add back in the explicit mass constraint, and then add a Lagrange multiplier, right? And it's very simple proof to show that solutions to this are the same as solutions to the original system, but now the constraint is stabilized, so to speak. The only problem is that now we've gone from index 0 to index 2. So we have to reduce the index, at least 1, so we can do a simulation. The kind of easiest way to reduce, so you could do sort of dummy derivatives here, but boy, is that going to get to be a mess, especially for the fluids problems. So the simple idea here is to just use like Baumgartner's method, where instead of writing that explicit constraint, we write a linear combination of the constraint plus its first derivative. And now that's down to index 1, and the mass constraint is stabilized. I don't think this is a great idea to do for fluids problems, because it's going to require a lot of surgery to the models, and it's going to make introduce a lot of coupling that's going to slow down simulations. But mathematically, it's very sound, and there is no change. So no change to the dynamics. So this is exact. So of course, I thought, well, I need an example for this. So I did the toy pendulum example. There's actually something to learn here that I was a little surprised by, but we've all done this, right? The first thing you do in math in Modelica is you write these 5 equations, and you think, oh, that's a weird way to write the equations for a pendulum, but okay. So if you do this and you look at what Dymola tells you here, of course it does a lot of manipulation of these equations, right? There's dummy derivative and all that, and it ends up choosing 2 states, the x and x dot, and it does some switching dynamically, right? So no surprise, no drift, perfect simulation, because we have 2 degrees of freedom and 2 states. But what happens if instead of so so these four equations are the equations of motion of the bob plus a position constraint. So this is the index 3 problem. What happens is instead of the position constraint, we put the velocity constraint. So now I have a different system, right? But this is now index 2. Give it to Dymola, and what does it do? It does something kind of interesting, but not surprising now that we know. It actually chooses 3 states. Even though it's a 2 degree of freedom system, it's going to choose 3 states. And then I have one eigenvalue at 0, which is that unconstrained direction, and the other 2 are stable. So this is exactly what we are doing in all our fluids problems, right? Except it's the simplest example. And then if we do this Baumgartner trick, so we add back in the constraint and rerun the simulation, again, there are 3 states, but now 1, instead of the pole being at the origin, it's at minus 1. So back to Carl. There's your answer, Carl. Actually, there are 5 slow modes. 4 of them are caused by modeling stupidity on my part. The rooms are adiabatic, and that's, leads to an origin, poles at the origin. But the one that's, there, that's a logarithmic chart. So it's at sort of 6 months of time scale, is the one that's due to the refrigerant. And I hope that's a more complete answer. I still think there's some issues to be understood relative to the dynamics of refrigerant mass. But, OK, so I think I'm done. Thank you.